So two of my former bosses teamed up again last night for a fundraiser in California. And while President Biden was speaking with former President Obama, he offered a pretty stark reminder of what's at stake in November, especially when it comes to the Supreme Court. This is exclusive video we just obtained from the Biden campaign. Take a listen.
The next president is likely to have two new Supreme Court nominees. Two more. He's already appointed two that have been very negative in terms of the rights of individuals. The Supreme Court has never been as out of kilter as it is today. I mean, never. I taught constitutional law for 9 years. This guy knows more about it than most. Look, the fact of the matter is that this has never been a court that's been this far out of step.
Some pretty strong words there from President Biden, somebody who usually has historically spoken in defense of the Supreme Court. Joining me now is Congressman Jamie Raskin. He's the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, and not to mention was also a constitutional law professor. What an expertise that has come in handy in the days we're living in, Congressman. It's great to see you. I just wanted to start with what we heard there. And, you know, a lot of people have been saying this, but the president has not been as critical at every moment at the Supreme Court. He has been more of late, but he basically said it's never been more out of kilter than it is today. I mean, do you agree with that?
Well, it's just operating like an arm of the Republican Party, which is now completely under the thumb of Donald Trump. And so if Trump thinks it's politically advantageous to make an alliance with the National Rifle Association, the Supreme Court's going to do it. We saw it in the bump stock opinion. Which basically overthrew the wisdom of the ATF, the executive branch of government, even when Trump was there and president, and said, oh, no, a bump stock added to a semi-automatic weapon cannot be treated as a machine gun because that's the NRA line. Now, we're going to go back and try to make this happen legislatively. That Vegas massacre took the lives of 58 people. There are 500 people wounded and still suffering from that day. I can't imagine what it's like for them to be watching this on TV with the Supreme Court making a mockery out of that experience.
It's so hard to watch these decisions, and then you pair that with kind of the ethical lapses is a very diplomatic way of saying it. I mean, we're learning more and more about Clarence Thomas and what he hasn't disclosed. We have a range of different flags that are similar to what the insurrectionists were flying, that Alito has been flying outside of his home. You know, one of the questions, and you've spoken to this a bit before, but I wanted to raise it with you because you can help explain to people what is possible here, is why can't these justices be hauled before the Senate? I mean, they could be subpoenaed. You've made the point, just for everybody to understand, that would require 60 votes in the Senate for the subpoena to be enforced. What else could be done that isn't being done?
Well, they could be brought over to the Senate with a Democratic majority, except they would need 60 votes in order to enforce the subpoena. The real problem is that there's no binding ethics code on the Supreme Court. So the highest court in the land has the lowest ethical standards. They're the only judges in America that don't have a binding ethics code applied to them. So, you know, we're working on a lot of legislation that we hope we'll be able to get through in the next Congress that would establish an inspector general over in the Supreme Court, which would probably clean things up rather quickly, create a binding ethics code. But the thing that I'm doing with the Ocasio-Cortez this coming week, and we've got some interesting Senate, cross-filers with us, is to say that the $50 gift ban that all members of Congress live under, and we basically just don't take gifts from lobbyists and people who want to influence, should apply to the Supreme Court. The idea that Clarence Thomas got millions of dollars of gifts as opposed to payments or bribes from a friend, sending him all over the world on travel. I mean, that's just
doesn't
absurd.
Pass the smell test.
No.
So is there anything, I mean, obviously a Democratic majority could then, a 60-vote majority could enforce it. Is there anything you wish the Senate was doing now, given how outspoken you've been? Around these justices?
I tell you, one thing that's very much on my mind is the leak of the Dobbs opinion, which, of course, destroyed Roe versus Wade. And when it was first leaked, we heard a lot from Chief Justice Roberts and Jim Jordan and the right wing about how they were going to get to the bottom of this, and it's never happened before. And I agreed with that. I mean, that's an unprecedented breach of Supreme Court protocol and procedure. They did a huge investigation, and then suddenly they went radio silent. And we've learned a lot more about Justice Alito and Justice Thomas and how immersed they are and their families are in right-wing politics. And I just wonder why somebody just blew the whistle on that investigation. I never thought it was going to be Elena Kagan or Justice Sotomayor. No, it wouldn't be that, but it very well could be Justices Alito and Thomas. And we haven't heard anything from anybody, and we don't know. You know, the Politico reporters who got the leak obviously know.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. You think it could have been one of the conservatives. I know other people think that. So I wanted to ask you just about another report in Politico. Shortly after Trump was found guilty on 34 felony counts, he apparently picked up the phone to call Speaker Mike Johnson and said, "We have to overturn this." According to this story, Johnson then, according to one person familiar with the conversation, Johnson then, a former attorney himself, of course, conveyed he already believed the House had a role to play in addressing Trump's predicament. The two have since spoken multiple times. So I guess my question for you, knowing the House as you do, is what do you expect? Do you expect Mike Johnson, to try to do something here to overturn? I don't even know what that would be, but what would it be? And are you worried about that?
Speaker Johnson at that time also invoked his personal relationship with a number of Supreme Court justices and underscored the importance of the Supreme Court superintending the case and reviewing what had happened in New York. But I think in terms of the House itself, what we're likely to see is them subpoenaing prosecutors from the state and local level, like in New York or in Georgia, in order to intimidate them and harass them, which is what they've done before. It's an absolute assault on federalism and the independence of the states, which they pretend to support. But of course, they don't when it comes to their overriding commanding imperative, which is just to support whatever Donald Trump wants at any point. I mean, it's an amazing thing when you think about it, that you have a guy who's poised to be a major party presidential nominee, and he doesn't call the Speaker of the House to deal with the problem of healthcare costs or infrastructure in the country.
Or the border in a proactive way.
Nothing he even claims to be interested in. It's all about his legal docket. And it's been like this for most of his adult life. He's had more than 3,000 cases. You know, I was up in Jersey recently campaigning for some friends like Mikey Sherrill and Billy Pasquarello, and I can't tell you the number of people I met who said, "Oh, yeah, Donald Trump and his businesses still owe my family tens of thousands of dollars. We were electricians or plumbers or small business people who did work with them in Atlantic City, but Donald Trump made it a habit not to pay the small businesses and the working class people who helped to outfit his various casinos that ended up going bankrupt."
I'm sure you're aware of the controversy that broke out over some comments Trump made about Milwaukee, which is, of course, hosting the Republican convention coming up later this summer. It was reported he called Milwaukee a horrible city. This obviously isn't a new thing for him. He called Washington a filthy and crime-ridden embarrassment. He's called Chicago worse than Afghanistan. He once called Baltimore a disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess. I mean, these are America's cities. What do you make of his comments and what's driving it?
Well, this is the spirit of the man, and we got to understand this. This is a person who doesn't love America. He demeans and degrades some of our most precious, beloved places. And when he demeans and degrades the places, he demeans and degrades the people that live there, the people that dedicate themselves to teaching in our schools, the firefighters, the police officers, the civic engineers. So many of these cities, I was a mayor of one, went through decades of losing population, losing investment. But there are cities all over America now that are standing back up, having investment come in, businesses move back to city centers, really exciting stories of promise. We don't need a president that punches down, that beats up, that divides us against each other, that degrades people and places. And it's just disheartening to see one of our major political parties elevating someone who doesn't celebrate America. I mean, the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan, of George Bush Sr., I mean, they were about celebrating this country, lifting this country up, seeing it for what it is. When I came to Newark, I moved into a really tough neighborhood, and I was sobered by some of the challenges that Newark was going through at the time and the neighborhood. And this great tenant leader challenged me, and she said, "Boy, you need to understand something. The world you see outside of you is a reflection of what you have inside of you." And she really challenged me to open my eyes and see the potential and the possibility, the hope and the dignity of the people. And I'll never forget that. And Donald Trump is really telling the story of who he is, not the story of who Milwaukee is.
Such a good point. It's a reminder. I mean, one of the things that's challenging about the politics, Senator, is there's just a lot to run against here. And I wanted to ask you about Trump's conviction and the politics surrounding that as well, because Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker said this about the conviction. He said, quote, "This is also what I believe is important to most Americans, particularly those in the middle who are ultimately going to decide this election." And I raise this because there's a lot to run against. I mean, do you share that belief that Trump being a convicted felon could be the most important factor for undecided voters at this point?
Again, I'm not sure. I'm obviously looking at focus group details. What I've seen, the evidence that moves people the most is the extraordinary achievements of the Biden administration that most Americans aren't aware of, what he's accomplished. This is a president that has a pathway. But I'm going to be one of those guys campaigning all over this country, not only speaking to the bright light and positive accomplishments of this president, but I'm going to try to remind people of who Donald Trump is in his own words or his own actions. And yeah, not only has he had 34 felony convictions, he is a convicted felon, but he has 2 pending federal felony indictments, both for interfering with an election, as well as how he's handled classified documents that endanger our national security. He's got a state felony conviction in Georgia, but that's not all. This guy has also been found by the New York Supreme Court. Him and his organization have been found liable and fined $450 million. The despicable and disgusting things he did to E. Jean Carroll. He's been fined tens of millions of dollars. Even his charitable activities were exposed by a judge to have been corrupt, and for his own personal benefit, he was forced to disband his charitable activities and pay, again, millions of dollars. Everything he has done in every aspect of his life, business, personal, charity, has now been by federal criminal and civil courts, state and federal criminal and civil courts, has been resoundingly condemned, and he has had to pay out millions of dollars of fines. This is a pattern and practice of who he is. He brought the greatest shame to our country. The only time that our capital has ever been taken over by a mob or violence was in 1814 due to the War of 1812, and again under his presidency. And so, to me, it's both. It's understanding the truth and the successes of a president who served under one of the most difficult times of service, took over our country when it was on the brink after Donald Trump's presidency and the pandemic, and has brought us some of the greatest success, especially relative to other nations, other peers, best economy on the globe right now in terms of economic growth, and then compared to what Donald Trump was, what Donald Trump has done in every area of his life.
You said, Senator, you have a lot going on, I think it's fair to say. You said on the Judiciary Committee, and I wanted to just ask you about the Supreme Court, because it seems like every week, and it seems like it's growing in recent weeks, there's a new scandal. There's Samuel Alito and the flags outside his homes. There were the tapes released this week of Alito sounding awfully partisan, I think it's fair to say. Your committee also reported this week that Justice Clarence Thomas took more trips than we knew about on a Republican mega donor's private plane. I mean, I could go on, but I'll stop there. This feels a bit like a crisis to me. I mean, would you like to see the Senate hear from some of these justices directly, or would you be open to subpoenaing them if necessary? There's not a lot of precedent for that, but we're in unprecedented times.
Well, a lot of these billionaires and these activists who've been trying for decades to capture our courts and have been obviously successful in influencing them, these billionaires who are taking people on these trips, folks like Harlan Crow and others, yeah, we've been trying to call them before the Senate. And the fact that this has fallen into the traditional partisan left-right divide is absolutely outrageous and unacceptable. This is not about partisanship. This is the fact that the highest court in the land should have the highest ethical standards, not the lowest. The fact that senators in Congress have higher ethical standards on our behavior than the Supreme Court, which literally the whole idea of avoiding appearances of impropriety is literally written into judicial ethics. The fact that now we've had people like Clarence Thomas receiving millions of dollars worth of perks and benefits from billionaires who have strong right ideological bents, who have deep investments in the outcome of court cases, is absolutely unacceptable and should be resoundingly condemned by all Americans. This is a crisis of our institution, and the justices involved who are not even willing to recuse themselves, like in the case of Alito, it's just shameful. And so we're going to continue to speak out about this. We're going to continue to call out the truth and to try to use the Judiciary Committee ultimately to bring about the change that all Americans on both sides of the aisle really do want, which is that our highest court in the land should have the highest ethical standards and judges that abide by it.
I mean, to your point, they're continuing to hand down opinions, right, as this ethics crisis unfolds. I mean, on Friday, they overturned a ban on bump stocks, which are used, for those who aren't aware, to make semi-automatic rifles fire more quickly. So there's a bit of a credibility, not just a bit, there is a credibility crisis here. Also, clearly, a bit of an extremism crisis. What's your reaction? You've done so much and spoken out about gun violence, to that decision on bump stocks.
The worst mass shooting in American history, all of our country's history, was a man with a bump stock that over 11 minutes fired over 1,000 rounds. That bump stock allowed him to convert his weapon into a mass-firing, multiple-round shooting gun that wounded over 500 people, killing 58. It was a horrific incident. My mom lives in Vegas, and the terror and the horror of that incident compelled President Trump to call for the ban of bump stocks. I think that Sotomayor in her dissent was right. It walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it looks like a duck. It is like converting a weapon to effectively a machine gun, which are banned. And so this is startling that we have a Supreme Court so out of step with our country. This is not controversial. People on the left and the right, a Republican president, called for the end of these devices in the wake of the worst mass shooting in our country, the horrors that it brought about. This should not be allowed in our nation.
No question. I know every day I'm scared a bit when my kids are sent off to school, given how available these guns are and bump stocks across the country. I want to ask you about IVF, because this has become an issue that has, unfortunately, it shouldn't be controversial. It's quite popular, IVF. Millions of women, so many women are able to have children because of it. You introduced a bill this week to codify IVF protections. It got a vote this week. It failed. And I think it's important, again, to restate how popular IVF is. It makes people able to be parents. All but 2 Republicans voted against it. For people wondering out there, what the heck is going on? Why would anyone oppose this? Why did all these Republicans vote against your bill?
Well, remember, when it comes to women's reproductive rights, writ large, in our nation, Democrats, Republicans, and independents all agree that this erosion of reproductive rights is unacceptable. And the majority of Americans believe in Roe v. Wade. The majority of Americans believe that people should have access to mifepristone. And the majority of Americans, overwhelmingly, upwards of 90%, say that we should have access to IVF. And our legislation was very basic. It said, number one, we need to protect these rights at a time, as we saw in Alabama, that extremist groups in legislatures and on the bench are trying to take them away. Number two, it said that IVF, which is very expensive, the miracle of having children should not be accessible only to the wealthy or to people that can find a way to pay the $10,000 to $20,000, and that simply more insurance carriers should cover that. And then finally, in a way that should have compelled more people to stand up and support it, is that military folks who are going off to service, often exposing themselves to conditions or injuries that could prevent them from having children, we should support our military personnel to freeze their sperm or their eggs and have access to this kind of treatment that can enable them and their families, often families that have 2, 3, 4, 5 generations of military service. We should allow them to also be able to access the dream of having children should they need IVF. It's a basic bill. And this was stopped in its tracks, didn't even get a debate in Congress by Republicans who do not represent writ large Republican sentiment. And so we are in a crisis in this country. And so we're going to continue to stand up and fight for women's reproductive rights. It is really going to play out in this election. What kind of people are we going to elect? Will you support the party and the people that are taking away individual freedoms and reproductive rights, or will we join together and protect them by electing people who will stand up for those reproductive rights?
Senator Cory Booker, that issue is on the minds, I know, of so many people out there, and so important to remind people that IVF is at risk, mifepristone is at risk, your rights to potentially birth control is at risk. It's not just Dobbs. Thank you so much, Senator, for joining me. I really appreciate all of the work you've done and the time you've taken to talk to me about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.